As I said, this is the LaRouche Pack Saturday Night class series. Tonight's class is entitled The Tragedy, Economics, and Leadership with Bob Ingraham, who will be joining us in just a moment. Now, for everyone watching, the class is marked by the extraordinary atrocity 2 days ago, which never happened before in 250 years of American history, the atrocity of indictment of a president who was also a leading presidential candidate in the forthcoming election. This has galvanized our citizens. There's an extraordinary responsibility placed on this generation of Americans to win back our country from a rotten, corrupt elite, which has gone so far as to indict a president, intervene in an election, attempt to close down the democratic processes of the country in pursuit of this elite dictatorship, which has launched a series of frame-up attempts against President Trump, place President Trump once again in the White House at the head of a movement which can ensure that he can accomplish the things which a subversive establishment kept him from accomplishing in his first term. So just before handing over the floor to Bob, which I'll do in just a minute, I'd like to direct you to our LaRouche Pack site and the statement we put out on March 31st by Barbara Boyd, Indictment, a day which will live in infamy and from which we will emerge victorious. And you can read it. It's also available in leaflet form if you go to the site. She compares the sudden change in thinking of Americans, which occurred with that atrocity of the indictment of President Trump, with the sudden change when Pearl Harbor was attacked, December 7th, 1941, as witnessed by Lyndon LaRouche. And she says, as we did then, this generation of Americans will rally, push back, and take back the country with a movement, the like of which has never been seen in human history. So with that brief note, let me hand over the floor to Bob for his class.
Okay, hi folks. Well, just to comment on what Tony just said, we really are. It doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter if you're 18 years old or 90 years old. We as a people are at a rendezvous with destiny. How we respond to this, how we act, how we intervene, what we fight for, the way in which we shape the battle, this is going to determine whether our republic continues to exist as it was formed in 1788 or 1787, and to a large extent whether human civilization will continue to exist and continue to move forward into the future. And I don't think that is an exaggeration at all. What I'm going to talk about tonight is tragedy. And, there are some people, maybe people on the call here, who might think that this is not the most appropriate discussion to have at this moment in time. We are obviously in the midst of a battle. And, some people might say, well, we should have a discussion or give a briefing, which is more positive, which uplifts people, which, kind of gets people into the fight. But, what I would argue, and what I am arguing, is that there's no way to comprehend the full nature of the crisis that we're in, or how to successfully rescue our nation without looking at this crisis through the lens of classical tragedy, particularly Shakespearean tragedy, but not limited to that. Tony referenced the crisis. Look, everyone knows that what is occurring is unprecedented, that the crisis is extraordinarily profound. Some people have likened this crisis to the Civil War, to the period leading up to the Civil War, 1858, 1859, 1860, when Abraham Lincoln was organizing the Republican Party and organizing his presidential campaign. But the reality is that what we are facing today is far, far worse than what occurred during the 1930s, what occurred during the 1850s. There's nothing like this in the memory of anyone living today, or even your father or grandfather or great-grandfather. The only thing that I know of comparable in European and American history to where we find ourselves right now was the crisis of the 14th century. Now, I know a lot of people don't know a lot about this, but you've heard of the Black Plague and things like that. But what you had at that time was the collapse, the bankruptcy, and the collapse of the entire European banking system, all of the major banking houses. This was then followed by a rapidly worsening economic collapse and famine and starvation, and then the Black Plague, and then the 100 Years' War, 100 years of warfare among a depopulated and impoverished, people throughout Europe. This is the kind of crisis that we're facing today, and in order to understand this, because it's difficult for people to wrap their heads around this. You talk about the 14th century and people go, but look, the problem we're dealing with is that most Americans, most people really, it's not Americans are a lot worse than anyone else. Most people know very little about the history of the world and the history of, European civilization. I mean, a lot of people in Europe think they do, but, they're looking through it through the lens of living under a central banking system for the last 150 years. If you want to understand where we are right now, minimally, you have to go back to 1763, the end of the 7 Years' War, with the defeat of France by the British Empire. Because that victory of the British and the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1763 essentially created the global British Empire, which was a maritime empire, a military empire, but it was first and foremost a financial empire. And that empire, which came into existence at that moment, began the process of looting people all over the world and creating a financial and banking colossus in the city of London. This is what we revolted against in 1775. But the truth is that what was created in 1763 with the British Empire, to fully understand that, you have to go back even much further into history. Now, again, these are ideas that people don't normally think about, but I would encourage you to think about them, because there is no way that we can fight and that we can successfully win the battle that we're engaged in right now if we do not really understand the battleground we're standing on, how we got here, what the actual issue is. So if you want to, you could say that 1763 is an inflection point, but in reality, what you have to go back to minimally, and it goes back even before that, but minimally, you have to go back to the Roman Empire. You have to begin to understand this question of an oligarchical state, an oligarchical empire, an oligarchical financial system, an oligarchical system of law, because outside of the United States, and there's exceptions here and there, but by and large, the system of law as it developed in Europe, was greatly influenced and to a large degree was based upon Roman law, Roman imperial law. And this then, in the modern era, we saw, or the sort of modern era, in the Middle Ages, we saw this Roman tradition of financial empire, of oligarchical rule. This was revived in Venice, and then it spread into Amsterdam and into London. And what you began to see was the emergence of these global oligarchical financial empires. And you have to look at the philosophy of these empires, because there's a lot of people who are writing at this time, in these various countries, in Holland, in Paris, in London, and elsewhere, in Italy, and the outlook that what they established was based on permanent oligarchical rule, in which the people of the nation were reduced to cattle, reduced to expendable, animals, but that the power was always to lie in the hands of the few, in the hands of a financial oligarchy. And this is what was established, with the Dutch Empire, with the financial center in Amsterdam. This is what was established in London with the empire and with the Bank of England. And this is what then was consolidated in 1763. That it's not just a system of military rule. And even though these are financial empires, it's not just a system of finance. It's a system of finance and culture. That what these ruling elites have done is to impose upon society a form of oligarchical culture, which denies really the creative and the divine nature of the human soul and the human mind, in which people are simply expendable, like dogs or sheep or goats, but that there is no recognition whatsoever that that human individuals are capable of discoveries, of technological progress, of creativity, of developing a better world for everyone. Now, that's what we revolted against, in 1775. And that's what we established the American Republic to fight against that. Initially to create the Republic in America. But everyone at that time knew that, even though the fledgling young America, which was, weak and undeveloped economically, that the fledgling, young America could not declare war against all these monarchies. We would have been destroyed. But nevertheless, everyone recognized that this oligarchical system was the enemy of the ideals of the American Republic, and that sooner or later, the mission of America was to rid the world of oligarchism once and for all. Now, if you look at, let me put it to you this way. If you look at the last century, the last 100 years, 110 years or so, everything that we have seen that has been destructive, that has driven the world backwards, has been a product of this oligarchical rule. World War I, World War II, the Cold War of the 1950s and 60s, and then what we've seen since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the New World Order of globalization, associated with people like, the Davos crowd today, the World Economic Forum, but, they didn't invent it. This is all a product of the financial oligarchy, and at the same time, what they have produced is an absolute destruction of our culture. Particularly if you look back to 1918, in the wake of World War I, during the 1920s, and then again later, the destruction of World War II, tens of millions of dead, unbelievable destruction. And things that occurred along with this. What you see, massively sponsored, financially, massively pushed by the oligarchical elite, is the spread of existentialism. Lyndon LaRouche once said that the legitimization of existentialism, I think he wrote this in Science of Christian Economy, I'm not sure, but he said the legitimization of existentialism has done more damage to European civilization, and you could include that as extended European civilization, including the United States, that existentialism has done more damage to extended European civilization than any other influence of the past 100 years, including Marxism, including Nazism, etc. The way Lynn put it is that they destroyed, absolutely obliterated, the Judeo-Christian concept of the human identity, of the human individual. And the way LaRouche put it was, quote, they did not ignore cognition, they gang raped it to death. You know, and this is the kind of culture that has been produced. And the reality is right now that since 1971, I mean, we've gone through a certain inflection points, but since 1971, we have been living increasingly under a global system of oligarchical tyranny. We are living under a tyranny. It is not the tyranny of the Biden administration or the tyranny of the Obama administration. You know, they are just merely the latest stooges, the latest frontmen for this oligarchical, game plan. But if you look at what has occurred since 1971, the absolute destruction of the productive economy, the looting of nations, the turning of our economic system or our banking system into nothing but a system of usury and financial speculation. And this has been, ratcheted up 2 or 3 times. After the 1987 stock market crisis, you had, the Federal Reserve coming in with its first wall of money, to bail out the financial institutions. Then the 2001 dot-com crisis, and then the big crisis of 2008 with Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns, et cetera. And at every turn, what they have done has been even more tyrannical and more destructive than what we have seen up to that point. Each crisis has been met by even more tyrannical and destructive policies to where we are today. Now we are at the end of this system. That's why I likened it to the 14th century, where the entire banking system of Europe, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, the Ascanoli, Frescobaldi, all of these families, all of these banks went under, bringing down Europe with them. And we are at that point today. Now, what the oligarchy will not do is they will not tolerate anyone to challenge this system. That you can do this, you can do that. You can be a Republican in Congress and say, let's, seal the borders. You can be a Democrat in Congress and let's say, let's have Medicaid for all. Or you can do all of these kind of little things around the edges, some of which might seem good or bad or whatever. But you are not allowed to challenge the dictatorship of the central banking system, of the financial oligarchy. You are also not allowed to challenge, which Tony referenced, the foreign policy, the geopolitical manipulation of the London, Wall Street, oligarchical elite. You are not allowed to challenge it. Look, in the 1950s, Dwight Eisenhower tried repeatedly, and people may know this or not know it, but he tried repeatedly to end the Cold War. He couldn't do it. He was surrounded by people like Allen Dulles, John Foster Dulles, and a lot of really bad people. Then when John F. Kennedy came in, he tried to, after some stumbles in his first year or so, he tried, he moved directly. He tried, very forcefully to end the Cold War. And he was murdered. And after he was murdered, we got the war in Vietnam and everything else. And now, since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, and then particularly after 9/11 in 2001, we have the foreign policy establishment of the United States, which is completely under the control of the financial oligarchy. Not the Chinese, not the Russians, the financial oligarchy. They are pushing us into war everywhere around the world. And, as Tony said, if you want to understand, why they are so intense to stop Trump, to prevent him from getting back in. Now, there's a number of reasons, but one of the primary reasons is that, if you look at the video he put out that he posted, on his presidential website, a week or two ago, 10 days ago, on the Ukraine, he's not just calling for peace in the Ukraine. He's not just saying, if I get in there, I can end the Ukraine war in one day. I mean, he's saying those things, but that's not all that he's saying. What he is saying is, I'm going to clean out the foreign policy establishment. I'm going to clean out the U.S. military. We are going to end this policy of ongoing war, of permanent war. He is doing what no one else is doing in terms of elected officials. I mean, there's a handful of people in the House of Representatives who are backing him on this and speaking up. But, in terms of people more high ranking, people, within the political establishment who have positions of power and influence, he is doing what no one is allowed to do, to challenge the strategic policies of the empire, of the oligarchy. Now, if you want another example of this, I'm not going to go into it, but this is precisely analogous to the targeting of LaRouche in the 1980s. It wasn't just that, the LaRouche movement was electing people around the country. This was all fine and good. We had a candidates movement. We were doing very good things. But it was LaRouche himself who was perceived as dangerous to the oligarchy, someone who could not be bought off, someone who could not be cowed into submission, and what LaRouche was proposing through the Strategic Defense Initiative was to put an end to the foreign policy doctrines which had dominated the United States since the Truman administration, to end them, mutual and assured destruction, etc. And to do this through finding a cooperation with Russia around scientific and technological advancement that would benefit both countries. What LaRouche was proposing was a deadly threat to the rule of the financial empire. And that is the way they perceive Trump. Now, I would pose to people that if you want to be if you want to try to figure out how we can win this fight, how we can win the fight that we're in, what you have to do is to think about how you would make yourself as dangerous to the oligarchy as Donald Trump is, or as Lyndon LaRouche was. Now, you may not quite get there, but to think about what it is that makes Donald Trump such a threat, what it is that made Lyndon LaRouche such a threat, and then to say to yourself, how do I become that kind of threat to oligarchical rule? And that takes courage, and it takes a commitment to begin to re-examine, a lot of the things which you might believe in, or think you believe in, or have grown accustomed to believing in or thinking. Now, so I said that this was going to be about tragedy. And, what I would pose to people right now is that at this moment, we are living in our lifetime, what you could call a potential tragedy. The curtain hasn't fallen yet. This is not a tragedy that we have to endure. It is not, it is one we still might escape from. We don't have to suffer the same fate as Hamlet or Macbeth. The economic solutions are there to save our country. Other things that can be done. There's all kinds of new technologies coming online, nuclear energy, water, space program, new inventions. There are a lot of ideas about reindustrializing America. There are ideas about rebuilding our educational system. There is a plethora of positive initiatives that can be made. But, it's not enough to just fight for one of those issues, or a couple of those issues, and say, this is what it's going to take. I'll just repeat what I said earlier. You have to think of how the world is run today. This is the job of a citizen. Normally, most people say, well, I'll let some big guy worry about that. Let somebody with a PhD from Harvard worry about that. That's how we got in the mess we're in, by letting those people, worry about things. We're citizens, and you have to think about how the world is run today. And the reality is that we are under a tyranny of a financial, monetary, banking system, an oligarchical system, which itself now is at the point of collapse. That's what all these things are with Silicon Valley Bank and everything else. We are at the point of collapse, like the Bank of Bardi, in the 1300s. We are at the point of collapse, and the thing is that under this system, particularly in the last 50 years, people have lost the ability to think rationally about economics. Look, we've discussed some of this before, and I'm not going to go into it in detail. We had a little discussion out here last week in California on this question of, money, and the free market and all of this. But people, it's like in his book, in his paper, report on the subject of manufacturers, Alexander Hamilton said, the intrinsic wealth of a nation is to be measured not by the abundance of the precious metals contained in it, but by the quantity of the productions of its labor and industry. In other words, wealth is not found in money. Wealth is found in the scientific, industrial, and technological advancement of your nation. Now, no economics class is, school in the United States, not Stanford, not MIT, not Harvard, none of them teach that. It's all about money, maximizing profits, maximizing financial wealth. But financial wealth is meaningless. As I said, LaRouche calls money an idiot. And, think of this picture. Take a wad of cash out of your pocket and place it on the table. Bunch of cash. Put it on the table in front of you. Do you ever see any of it get up and walk away? Money has no intention. Money has no brains. Money has no conscience. All constitutional money, is issued by our sovereign government. The question is, what do you do with that money? And we have lived under a tyrannical financial system which has directed all monetary wealth into usury, into speculation, into financial looting, and into shutting down our productive economy. This is an attack on the people. It's an attack on you and I. It's an attack, a murderous attack on our children, which the financial oligarchy carries out every single day. So this system has to be replaced if we want a future. So now I'm going to, on this question of tragedy, I'm going to read you something from Lyndon LaRouche, which you may find, which may seem contentious, but it's something that LaRouche insisted on over and over and over again. And I can tell you that over the years, many people didn't like him saying this. There were people who didn't agree with him, but he never wavered from this outlook. And what he insisted is that the problems we are facing today, the crisis that we're in, the destruction of our nation cannot be blamed on bad leaders, but rather on the moral corruption of the people themselves. Now, that's not me saying that. That's Lyndon LaRouche, and it's almost verbatim. I mean, I could find 20 quotes where he says that. The problem is not bad leaders. The problem is the moral corruption within the people. The famous quote from Julius Caesar, the fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves. Now, most people don't like to think that, Pelosi, Biden, Obama, Mitch McConnell, these bad people. If only we had term limits, we'd all be fine. Well, that's not what LaRouche thought. It's not what I think. And I'll read you a quote from by LaRouche from a work he published in 2004. This is a work called The Coming Eurasian World. Excuse me. He says, a tragedy does not represent a calamity whose primary cause is an error by the current leadership of society. Rather, both the selection of and the relevant failures by that leadership are determined by the systemic features of the culture. Look at the folly of the Peloponnesian War and learn, as Plato understood and showed in his dialogues, that this was not the mistake of a leader, but of the way in which the behavior of leadership, from Pericles through Thrasymachus and the sophists of the Democratic Party of Athens, was governed by the ruling moral degeneracy permeating the leading institutions of the population of Athens during that span of decades. And there's other things that I could mention related to this, including Lynn's frequent references to the question of the shadows on the wall in Plato's cave, where, people mistake the shadows for reality, and where you have a situation where people are trapped by the axioms of their thinking, by the manner in which they think. People are trapped by it. So they swim around in circles like a goldfish in a bowl. Now, what I want to sort of conclude with here is to reference Shakespeare's play, Julius Caesar, and on this question of tragedy. And, this is not something that is unique by any means to Julius Caesar. And in fact, one of the places where it's addressed, most thoroughly. I mean, Shakespeare wrote all these phenomenal plays, but, among his lesser known plays to the average person, one of the areas where this question of tragedy is addressed, repeatedly and gone through again and again is what are called, his history plays, which I don't know why they're called history plays. I don't know who invented that term. Shakespeare certainly didn't invent it, because a history play like, Richard III is every much a tragedy as, Hamlet or Macbeth or Julius Caesar. They're all tragedies, and the, but, it's in the, if you look at Shakespeare's what are called his history plays, what he's examining is the rule of England, for almost 300 years by the House of Plantagenet, which was this French oligarchical house, hereditary monarchy, which married into the, British throne and, established what are called the Plantagenet dynasty. Sometimes it's called other things. But if you look at all of his plays, he traces the whole history of this Plantagenet dynasty over a period of 200 to 300 years, from King John, all the way down through Richard III. And what he's examining is this oligarchical rule in England, and the flaws of the culture, of the society under this oligarchical rule. And and you have Henry IV, Henry V, Henry VI, part one, part two, part three. You have all of these, but he's examining this, and the and he's delving into, the culture that was produced under oligarchical rule, which then controlled how people thought, how people acted, how people perceived what was possible, how people didn't even understand the processes that were destroying them. They couldn't see them. As most people today can't see that it is the central banking system which is destroying their children. They were blinded. Now, but I want to talk about Julius Caesar, because, I don't know how many people here are familiar with Julius Caesar. It is a phenomenal play. And they actually made a pretty good film out of it too. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it might be one of the best, or maybe even the best Hollywood film of a Shakespeare play. It was done in 1953. And you can rent that or get that, and it's done pretty well. But it's, you have to think about it, because the general way people think about tragedies, who really, the way they're taught in school, let's put it that way. If you go to school and study Shakespeare, a tragedy has a flawed hero, like Hamlet, like Macbeth, who fails to rise to the occasion, has a protagonist who, for one reason or another, fails. Well, that's not really what a tragedy is at all. And in particular, this is very clear in Julius Caesar, because there is no hero in Julius Caesar. Now, if you've seen the play or read the play and you think that Brutus is the hero, well, you need to go back and watch it again. There are no heroes in the play. Everyone is flawed. Everyone is trapped within the axioms of the system. Shakespeare starts the play off with a couple of, quick jabs, which people are familiar with because they've become so famous. There's, at the very beginning of the play where one of these Roman elites is talking to another one, and they're looking at the people in the marketplace who are, doing these very foolish things. One of them addresses the people and says, "You blocks, you stones, you worse than senseless things," right? And then, of course, shortly after that, you have this scene where, to repeat what I said before, where Cassius says to Brutus, "The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings." So Shakespeare is giving you a few little jabs there, to try to provoke you into thinking about things. But what most people who read this play, and almost all the people, maybe there's a really good professor somewhere, I don't know, but the way it's taught, what is missed by almost everyone is that the most important character in Julius Caesar is Cicero, and he's barely in the play at all. He's only in, I think, 2 scenes, in the background as part of a group of people, and he only has 4 lines in the whole play, and they're fairly inconsequential lines. He's sort of an unseen, almost unseen, nearly unseen presence in the play, but he is the key presence as to what Shakespeare is getting at, because there's this scene. Again, this has a line which is very famous, but people, it's become sort of the nub of jokes in Hollywood movies. But there's this scene in Act 1, Scene 2, where Shakespeare is out in, I don't know, somewhere. Not Shakespeare. Caesar is out somewhere, with the crowd in the forum, or not the forum, but somewhere out in some big place where people are crowding around Caesar, and Mark Antony offers the crown to Caesar 3 times. It wants Caesar to accept the crown and be crowned king. Caesar refuses it 3 times. Then it's this big hubbub, people shouting and yelling. And after that's over, one of the people who's there, one of the people who later is part of the plot to assassinate Caesar, comes back to the a meeting with the conspirators, the people who are plotting Caesar's assassination. And Casca reports on what just happened, everything that just went on with this attempt to crown Caesar king. And then Cassius asked the question, did Cicero say anything? And Casca replies, he spoke Greek. And Cassius says, to what effect? And Casca replies, those that understood him smiled at one another and shook their heads. But for mine part, it was Greek to me. And then they sort of move on from there. Now, you have to understand who Cicero was. And, Cicero, we could give, a half a dozen Saturday night classes on Cicero at some point in the distant future when we have more leisure time. But Cicero was the great follower of Plato in the final years of the Roman Republic. Now, I'm not putting him on the same pedestal with Plato, but he was a Platonist and a follower of Plato, and a champion of the ideals, of the Athenian culture that had produced Plato, in the years leading up to the creation of the Roman Republic. And, this reference to, that Cicero speaks, but I can't even understand what he says. It's Greek to me. I can't even understand the words coming out of Cicero's mouth, which is what Casca reports. What is being hinted at, but more than hinted at, what is being referenced there is the imminent death of Platonic culture in Rome. And the conspirators who are plotting to kill Caesar, they don't even really comprehend what's going on. They say Caesar is ambitious. Mark Antony wants to make him a king, but they don't really understand what the underlying profound shift that's occurring really is. That the concept of Plato and Plato's understanding of the human mind and the human identity and the creativity of human nature is dying, right? And because they're all trapped within their own individual ambitions and what have you, there's none of them who are any good. And then later you see in the play, and I'm not going to dwell at this, the famous speech by Mark Antony, the one that begins, friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. Where you have this crowd, first they hear Brutus, first they're angry at the assassins, they all love Caesar, these plebeians in the crowd. Then Brutus speaks and they are won over and they all love Brutus. They're ready to crown Brutus king, for killing Caesar. And then Mark Antony speaks and, they're won over by him. It's a crowd that is being led around by slogans, by emotions. They understand nothing of what they're living through. So and I could tell you, you even see this, just to reference it, in some of the best products of, 20th century drama, and, which does not rise to the level of Shakespeare or really a lot of other great dramatists, but you see it in, Eugene O'Neill's The Iceman Cometh. You see it in Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman. There's no heroes in these plays. There's no failed tragic heroes. In Hickey in The Iceman Cometh is not a tragic hero. Willie Loman and his son Biff, they're not heroic protagonists. They are people trapped within a culture, trapped within, it's almost as if, there's some kind of maze in your mind, like a rat's maze, in which you travel around within that maze, but you never escape it. They cannot see the culture that is destroying them, the fallacies of that culture. And a lot of people today cannot really see you could see some of the blatant evil that's going on, transgenderism and other things. You could see some of the blatant evil, but the axioms of our culture, which have become commonplace in our society, which people accept, like the fact that wealth is money, but there are many other things. There's no simplistic answers to solving the crisis we're in today. The way Lynn wrote about it, I'll give you two quotes from Lynn, and this is how I'm going to end it. When he's talking about the essence of tragedy, he says, could the protagonist have broken the spell of his historically specific doom, or will he or she prove to be merely another pitiable member of that self-doomed culture who could not muster the will to change that culture in the ways needed to save the people from the culture of which they are a part? And then later in the same work, he says, no situation ever exists which is the same at different points in history. And a historically specific crisis requires a creative act of hypothesizing a solution for a problem which never existed in history before and that never will be produced in the same way again. So that's where we find ourselves today, in a crisis which has never existed in the same way before and will never be produced in the same way again. And we have to understand the nature of this crisis. We have a financial, oligarchical, ruling class which is murdering the human race, literally, and which is taking us into World War III. This is what they are doing. And, I'm not going to go into, things like LaRouche's 4 laws right now or that kind of thing, but the solutions are there. If people begin to grapple with, thinking through the actual nature of the world we live in. I'm sort of, rambling on here, but just, think about what I said very early in this presentation. Since 1763, which is now, 260 years, I believe, the world has been run by the British Empire. including the modern version of it. A global financial oligarchical empire. It runs the world, and there is no way out of our current crisis unless we eliminate that empire completely from the face of the earth. So that is where I'll stop, folks. Okay.